Now for another local hero and an international hero, Dr. Kathleen Heide. She's a full professor at USF's Department of Criminology. You know, there's an old expression, you know, you think global and you act local. And what I didn't realize about Dr. Heide, she's been on like 12 community boards locally, but she is one of the world's leading experts on juvenile homicide offenders and adolescents who kill their parents, called Parricide. She's written several books, I think 4. The titles of 3 of them are Why Kids Kill Parents, The Challenge of Juvenile Homicide, and the most recent is Understanding Parricide, When Sons and Daughters Kill Parents, which is probably the definitive work in this area throughout the world. She's published over 100 scholarly publications. She's a licensed mental health professional in Florida since 1991 and understands assessments of kids, has interviewed kids, I think in 14 different states and in Canada, if I'm not mistaken. And beyond that, a couple of the accolades. She was invited by the Queen Sofia of Spain to present her research on juvenile homicide at an international conference held on youth violence in Valencia. And most recently, by the way, it is available on YouTube. I saw it. It was terrific. She gave the opening address on her work on parricide at an international conference sponsored by the Griffith University in Australia. So welcome, a USF professor and a local and national hero.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, great, thanks. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm right in your way. All right, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here today, and particularly with my esteemed colleagues. Today I'll be talking pretty much about juvenile homicide offenders in general, and the question and answers, if you're interested in parricide, kids killing parents, please ask me. All right, let's see if I can get this to work all right. There we go. Just going to start off by asking if anybody knows who this is. Who is? Janet Reno. Good. That's very good, because I put this on in my classes. They don't know who it is. Former Attorney General. So that's very reassuring. And I remember this very clearly. In the summer of 1993, Ms. Reno was at a news conference, and she was asked by reporters, what is the single greatest crime problem facing America today? And without a moment's hesitation, she did not say terrorism. She didn't say drugs. She said juvenile violence. And that was because for 10 years, every year, arrests of juveniles was going up and up and up and up for violent crime, and particularly what was very alarming was in homicide, arrests for murder. Now, what I'm going to do in the next 25 minutes is just give you a little bit of background about my experience so that you can have an idea of some of the analyses. I'm going to talk about trends in juvenile homicide, because honestly, I've spent the last 30 plus years doing that. Then I'm going to talk about characteristics of 50,000 juvenile homicide offenders in the United States from my own research, common diagnoses that I see when I evaluate kids who kill. And then I'm going to talk about system processing, not only in Florida, but across the United States. And then I will talk about 3 very important Supreme Court decisions that impact juvenile offenders, particularly, I should say, homicide offenders. Talk about recidivism of this group based on other studies and my own. And then if we have time, a little clinical snapshots, or you can ask me during the question and answer, and effective treatment. So what I'd say is fasten your seatbelts, and here we go. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about is a little bit about the data set that I use. It's called the Supplementary Homicide Report Data. And the local law enforcement across the country provide data to the FBI, about 90%. And the FBI then uses that data to come up with national estimates of kids or individuals who've been involved in homicide. What I've analyzed, and I'll be talking about this today, is data that spans over 30 years with some of my colleagues from USF and others. I don't know if John Cochran is here. I worked with him. Noir Khachatrian, who's one of my graduate students, worked with him, and Dr. Elder Solomon. So I've analyzed that data, and I'm going to be reporting on it, so we'll know what the picture looks like in the United States. Then also, as Mr. Engelhardt said, I've evaluated kids, actually goes back about 30 years, and about 150 in terms of violent crimes, almost all of them for murder or attempted murder. And I'll be reporting on this sample of kids over 30 years in terms of when they got out and what happened to them. All right, now what I just want to say is to put it in perspective in terms of juvenile violence. There were spikes in particular in two time periods, 1960 to 75, and then 84 to 93. That's when we were at basically near epidemic proportions in this country. What that led to, and you saw the reference to Janet Reno, is that in the United States, between the late 80s and early 1990s, every state in this country made it easier to get juveniles into the adult system. And that's very important, because what it meant, and this is in my day, is that juveniles I evaluated were facing the death penalty. Exactly, right? And they were also facing, and they still are, life without parole and some very extreme prison sentences. And again, that was across the country. So in the early 1990s, and this became an issue in the election, this last election, because it was referenced to super predators. And that's what was predicted as we were going into the 90s, that as the juvenile population increased, what would happen is that there would be more of these, quote, super predators, and that we would literally see a bloodbath of violence in this country by juveniles. Fortunately, the experts were wrong, so we can breathe a sigh of release. Juvenile homicide arrests have actually declined since the early 1990s, and there was a very nice analysis done by a sociologist expert, Frank Zimmering. He looked at data from 1960 to 2011, and what he concluded based on the national data, and that is that juvenile homicide arrests of kids for murder, were basically at a 45-year low. I extended that to 2015, the latest for which we can get data at this point, and that has held. So we're looking at, hopefully, a new normal. Now let me just put it in perspective very, very quickly, because this will really crystallize it. And that is, if you look at the high point, 1993, and all the data are there, but I'm just going to highlight, 16% of all arrests in the United States involved juveniles, for homicide, for murder. 16%, which if you think in terms of fractions, 1 out of 6 arrestees for homicide were juveniles. Fast forward to 2015, and we're near the low point, and it's 1 out of 7. And that would be about 1 out of 14. So from 1 out of 6 to 1 out of 14. That is good news. But still, these kids are going through the adult system where they face very long sentences. All right, so I'm going to talk about my work and what's done with colleagues about national profiles. And I'm going to do this quickly because the media often gives us a very different kind of perception. So I just want you to have a quick idea of what the data say based on 50,000 arrests of juveniles in the United States over a 37-year period. And the kids would be anywhere from age 6 to age 17. Now, SHR data, just so you know, is basic data. It gives data on like demographics, offender victim, age, race, sex, where some case-related things, where it happened, region of the country, state, year, what kind of weapon was used, what the victim-offender relationship is. It doesn't give anything on diagnoses, on mental health history, on Baker Acts. That's not available in the data set. So it's very basic data. All right, with that, just note, I'm going to do this quickly, so I'm talking about juvenile homicide arrests national over a 37-year period. Note that 98% are teenagers. So little kids, and this has been, I've been following this since the 60s, this has not changed. Most juveniles who commit murder are teenagers, particularly 15, 16, and 17 years old. Now the next slide may surprise you because it's on gender or sex, and you'll find, maybe some of you would predict this, but it's interesting in that 92% of juvenile homicide offenders are male, and that has not changed over the last 30 years. So we don't see more girls being arrested for murder. Now this is an unsettling slide because this looks at race, and you'll see I've highlighted for you black under black youth, and you'll see that when we look at arrests nationally of juveniles, 55% of those kids who are arrested for murder are black, and that's 4 times what we would expect in the population. So that's a concern that Jocelyn Elders, who was the Surgeon General back in the 90s, recognized as a concern, the victimization and offending rate in the African American community. I highlighted Asian, which is quite small, but I just want to mention to you very quickly that over that 37-year period, say the last 20 years, we're seeing more arrests of Asian youth for gang-related homicides. All right, now I'm going to point this out quickly because it's very relevant to juveniles and different than adults. If you'll note the yellow, single victims, 96% of juveniles who are arrested kill 1 victim. They don't kill multiple victims, meaning at the same incident. And then if you look at how many are occurring with accomplices, in other words, kids kill in 49% of the cases a single victim if you add in multiple offender situations, and then if you add when they kill multiple victims at the same time, over 50% of juvenile homicides occur with friends. So we're talking about peer pressure, risk-taking, very relevant to juveniles. Note the proportion in the South. Now, it's proportionate to the population, but clearly we see some regional differences. So the South leads in arrests of juveniles for murder, followed by the West, Midwest, and Northeast. Locations, again, this very consistent over time, going back to the 60s. Large city phenomenon, 60% of juvenile homicide arrestees come from the cities. And then there's this period that Janet Reno was talking about and that led to these crime control policies across the country. What we see is 34% of those 50,000 kids who were arrested, 34% were arrested during that period, and that's far more than we would expect based on the number of years. And it has gone down proportionately, as you can see, over the later period. All right, what are they getting arrested for? Again, just briefly, just note the conflict-related is 35. You add that with the gang-related, you're looking at about 50% of arrests of juveniles dealing with some kind of conflictual situation. So again, something, if we talk about treatment and prevention, is something we could do a lot there about. 70% firearms, this has increased over time. So if we go back to the earlier period, you'd see firearms less, but it has become more common as the weapon of choice. Strangers, I would just have you note, is about 1 out of 3. So juveniles, and this is consistent with adults, tend to kill people that they know. Now there are some gender differences, and I love to talk about this because I've done some, this is based on my work with colleagues, that most of the work has been done on males, as you might imagine, because males commit the bulk. But there are some very important gender differences that really bode for prevention and for intervention. So very quickly, I'll just highlight these. Girls, relative to boys, are significantly more likely to kill intimate partners, to kill children under age 5, including their own offspring, to kill family members, to use a weapon other than a gun, so to use a knife in particular, to kill female victims, to be in conflict, to be involved in conflict-related homicides, and also to use accomplices to kill family members, and I'm underscoring family members. Boys, on the other hand, are significantly more likely to kill adolescents and adults, and to kill strangers, to use a gun, to kill a male victim, to be involved in crime-related homicides, to be involved in gang-related homicides, and then also to use just accomplices in general. All right, so let's talk about some mental health issues. Now, if you look at work of others and you look at the literature, what you see predominantly, there aren't a lot of studies, but you see these kids listed as having, or diagnosed as having, conduct disorder and substance use. Not a surprise, conduct disorder meaning a behavioral disorder, they're committing crimes. That's true, I'm not disagreeing, but what is often missed and masked, I find this, others have not found it because they don't dig sometimes deep enough. And sometimes I heard this expression by clients, drive-by evaluations. If you don't spend time with kids, you don't really know why they do some of the things they do. A lot of these kids are clinically depressed and would meet the criteria for depression. ADHD is not surprising with the conduct disorder. What was missed for so much, and we were talking about this at dinner last night, is the trauma these kids have experienced. But if you don't ask kids about things, they're not going to tell you. And, you know, things like this, and I'll give you some idea of a case, recent case. Mother dies at age 7. She was an alcoholic, by the way. So think about that, losing your mom at age 7, right? Then your father's gone, your mom moves in with somebody. He's apparently a good man, but when she dies, the family relocates, no more contact with that individual. And then brother murdered, and you start counting up all these adversive offense. That is typical, but if you don't ask and if you don't look, you don't find that. So these kids are PTSD, rarely psychotic, so not in terms of some of what the judge has been talking about and Dr. Lorigio. You don't see that, but you see psychotic symptoms, and I've seen that in others, particularly paranoid ideation, given where some of these kids are coming from, is not particularly surprising. So not psychotic. What happens in this country, and this is a shame, when I've spoken in Europe, people are aghast when I tell them this, is that almost all kids who are involved in homicide, unless they're very little, are going through the adult criminal justice system. They are going to be convicted and they're going to be sentenced to prison. Now the kids that I'm reporting on, the kids that I deal with, and this is not unusual to Florida, are going into adult prisons, which are horrible places. I mean, when people tell you they're country clubs, they're not talking about the prisons the kids I evaluated are in. They are really very criminogenic places. Even when judges, and I've had great judges who've ordered treatment, there's no treatment to be had in prison of any significance. So the recidivism is not surprisingly high. Now there's some studies, and I'm just going to do this very quickly, that followed kids from 1 to 16 years. Some were in the juvenile system, some were in the adult. On the average, basically they were all reporting the same thing. 60% have recidivated, either a new crime, a new arrest, reincarcerated, convicted. So it's about 60% across those 5 studies. Now I'm going to talk about a study I did with one of my graduate students, Nawar Khatchatrian, is on this study and a lead author on 4 publications. We followed up on 59 boys that I evaluated 30 years ago, and they were convicted of murder and they were put in the adult prison system. And we followed up in terms of arrests. We wanted to see what happened to them. And just very quickly, these are the demographics. About 2/3 were black, most coming from a high crime neighborhood. 76% had a prior record. Violent record was about 45%. And the average number of arrests these kids had had, remember these are kids that are under 17, average number of arrests was 4. They were arrested on the average at 16 for homicide, some as early as 14, and their first arrests were anywhere from age 7 to 16 with an average of 13. So the first arrest was at age 13 on the average. Mostly they killed strangers. The victim died. Remember I said there were some attempted murders in that group, and they had 3/4 had accomplices. Firearms less, because this is the early 80s, and circumstances here were more crime-related, 73%. Okay, so here are the results, and this is the longest study that's been done. The N is small, but it is in fact the longest study that exists on juvenile homicide offenders, and it's dismal. Maybe not surprising. 8 offenders have never been released of the 59, so they're still in prison. They are no longer boys, they're grown up. 3 died in prison or during escape, so they didn't live long enough to get out. Now what's surprising is that 48 out of the 59 were released, and the mean time served was 8 years. Now, why it's surprising is because back then, kids were getting very, very long sentences, 50 years, 99 years, but sentences were calculated different. And so for first-degree premeditated murder, the most that a kid would get if they were convicted was a mandatory 25. They get life with a mandatory 25 and they could get out. And then life back in the day meant about 17 years, and they'd get time for good behavior, so they'd be out in 6 or 7 years. So the point I'm making is, even though they had long sentences, these kids were getting out, so it's sort of a natural experiment in a way. So here's the recidivism over 30 years, and it's not good. 88% of the offenders were rearrested. 88%, almost 90%. That is not good. The mean time from being released to rearrest is about 2.5 years, and that's consistent with other studies. It's not particularly surprising. What's surprising is that 88%, or what's unnerving. And then note the next thing, and this is what really should concern us as a society, because this is crazy what's happening here. 63%, almost 2 out of 3 of the individuals released were released for violent crimes. And you'll note, and this is a first to have a 10% response or rate, 5 of them were rearrested for murder in 4 cases completed and 1 case attempted. So those are horrible results. Those are unacceptable results. And then if you just want to see the numbers, total arrests, you can see they were arrested 359 times. The average is about 7.5. The winner, if you want to call that, and I put that in quotes, was 30 arrests. Violent arrests, 1 individual was actually arrested 23 times. Collectively, 146 arrests for violent crimes, and the mean is average was about 3. So those are terrible results. And we did an analysis. We put in independent variables to see if there were any way we could predict who these kids would be that became the violent offenders. And you'll see, well, it's a little hard to see. There's one when we did this regression analysis, the only one that remains significant, and this is an important finding, is length of time served. Those who served less than 6 years, and so they would have been about early 20s at the most, they were more likely to get back in trouble. So that may go to development, which I'm going to talk about. They were 6 times more likely to be arrested for a violent offense if they got out in less than 6 years. And similar findings in a recent study, another recent study of 10 years. Okay, so the 3 cases, why this is so important. Because of recent Supreme Court decisions, the likelihood that kids who commit homicide or who are convicted of murder, the likelihood is they're going to get out. And the cases, if you're probably aware of this, Roper versus Simmons found or held that juveniles could no longer be sentenced to death. The second one was Graham versus Florida, held that life without parole was unconstitutional for kids who committed a non-homicide. So that would be like robbery, rape, kidnapping. And then Miller versus Alabama, which has become very important to the work I'm doing, held that juveniles who were convicted of first-degree murder could no longer be sentenced to mandatory life without parole. So they can still be sentenced to life without parole, but not mandatorily, meaning that the judges have to give them a sentencing hearing and consider factors in mitigation. And the Supreme Court said it should be the rare juvenile the rare juvenile who is sentenced to life without parole. So the bottom line is these kids are going to get out. What impacted the Supreme Court was the neurobiology of the brain, meaning that the last area of the brain to develop is the prefrontal cortex, and I know a lot of you know this, which is the area associated with thinking, critical analysis, decision making. And this court also recognized that kids on the average, meaning those under 18, are much less mature than adults on the average. Now, I'm just going to go through this very quickly, but the criminal justice system assumes, particularly the adult system, that offenders recognize that they are accountable for their behavior, right? That they have choices. They assume that they know not only right from wrong, but believe, that in that, and have an internalized value system, and have a sense of feelings and motives and empathy. And the reality is, about 40% of the kids I evaluate are not there. They don't realize that they're accountable and that they have choices. I'm going to give you one quick story, because this is a true case. I had a kid I evaluated. He saw a jogger in the park, sort of like this jogger. All he had on was his shorts and his sneakers, but he had on a chain, like a gold chain. The 15-year-old wanted that chain. So he's on a bike, he rides his bicycle up right in front of the jogger, gets in front of him, and he takes the gun like that, and he just points it. According to witness accounts, the jogger stops. He's frozen. And the kid then, and he says to the kid says to him, "Give me your chain." And that's when he freezes. So now, according to witness accounts, the boy then cocks the trigger, and he says to him, "Give me your chain." At which point, the jogger turns, starts running, and the 15-year-old puts 4 shots in his back. When I said to him, now listen to the way I asked him the question, "Do you see any way this whole thing, not crime, this whole thing could have been prevented?" He said, "Yes. He could have given me the chain. After all, I asked him twice." He doesn't see himself as responsible. Who's at fault here? Yeah, the victim, absolutely, or the jogger. More later. Okay, so after Graham, what I do certainly is I look at when I'm doing resentences, and Mr. Engelhardt didn't mention this, I am now in the position, this is wild, I am reevaluating kids that I saw at 15, 16 years old. And I have this memory, very visual, like many of you have, because I remember them at 15 or 16. So they come in, and I'm thinking in my head, there's this 15-year-old, and now all of a sudden this big man comes in. He's 45 years old. So I'm a little surprised. He looks different, I know. But anyway, so I'm talking to him, but I realize too many times it's the same 15 years old. He hasn't changed. The perceptions are very, very similar. So that's a scary thing. So I look at where he is now, and then of course we look at mitigation, because now, as the judge can tell you, that is something that must be done by the courts. And there's always mitigation. I can tell you, based on 30 years of experience, I've never met a juvenile homicide offender who is a healthy, happy, well-adjusted kid from a loving family. It just doesn't happen. These kids have really come from trauma. They have a number of adverse childhood events, and if you don't ask them, you don't find out. And there's a very nice article by some of my colleagues, Brianna Fox, Liz Cass is on it too, called "Trauma Changes Everything." Ask me about that during the break. All right, so I already mentioned some of these kids literally, they're now adults, are frozen in time, and that's a concern, because if they're going to get out, that puts us at risk, as we've seen that. And why is it? Because core issues have not been addressed. Now, I can go more into this at the questions, but I'm going to give you one example of a case I recently evaluated. I evaluated him at 16. So we're talking, and I just cut to the chase. He had almost like a mantra. He'd been in over 25 years, coming up for resentencing. He killed an elderly woman during a burglary. Wasn't intended, but he killed her. Absolutely, no question. His mantra was, and he believed it, he kept saying to me, he thought it was unfair, spent all this time, he should get out. He kept saying, I made one simple mistake. I made one simple mistake. Well, most of us would agree, killing somebody is not a simple mistake. Okay, so what do the failures boil down to? Quickly, it's easy. Prison experience. Couldn't think of a worse place to put these kids than in a prison. And there are horrible things that happen in a prison, and you know them. Inadequate assessment. You know, what are we dealing with here? We're dealing with traumatized individuals, and if you don't treat the trauma and you release them, and I'll give you story after story where it's reenacted. It's sad, but it's also very much of a concern to society. The lack of effective treatment in prisons, and as the more and more have gone into prisons, the little bit of services there have been taken out because of cuts and security needs. Trauma is not addressed in inadequate aftercare. That I'd like to talk to in the talk. And then you can see there are components of effective treatment. Most of these, we've already talked some about these, the cognitive behavioral. Vicky Agee was a psychologist who ran a very successful treatment facility in Ohio for years for kids who were involved in murder and other serious crimes. So that's her list. What I underscore is the need for effective and extensive assessment, and then also what I added with my colleague, Dr. Elder Solomon, educational and vocational programming, which is a no-brainer. But for years, juveniles convicted of homicide and other serious crimes received no vocational training. Why? Because they thought they were never going to get out. So they are ill-prepared and resolving the trauma. I'm not going to go into this now, but we talked a little bit about trauma. What and Dr. Solomon and I have written about this, what's really important is to resolve the trauma, to treat the trauma and the associated, process the trauma and the associated feelings. EMDR is very much a proven treatment that we both do. Model program, happy to tell you more, in Giddings, Texas, where they work with dealing with the feelings. And what this program has had very good success rate. What I want to just read here, their program overview, and it's important. They say the connection between emotion and cognition enables youth to develop remorse and personal accountability for their life choices. Cognitive restructuring, or the replacement of delinquent rationalizations with pro-social attitudes, is more successful when reconnected to underlying feelings. So cognitive behavioral therapy is good. It's been proven effective. My point is it's not enough. We've got to do the emotional work, which is very much rooted in biology. All right, and here's some just data. I'll just highlight the last two from the Giddings School. 55% less likely to be reincarcerated, 66% less likely to be rearrested. So we could have better results. All right, so where are we now to wrap up? Well, there is good news. It wasn't a lot, but that's why I want to highlight it. Okay, yeah, please tell us the good news. All right, the good news is juvenile homicide is at basically a near 50-year low. I mean, that is great news. The reality is juveniles are likely getting out, juvenile homicide offenders. Recidivism is very high, unacceptably high, and we can do better. What do we need to do? Thorough assessment at first arrest. You know, so many of these kids were in shock, and I still get this. They say to me, I can't believe I'm being processed as an adult. They've been arrested many times, but nothing ever happened to them. They might have gotten probation, but that's their perception. All right, and then we've got effective treatment, intensive aftercare, and community support. And I'll address that in the talk, or I'm sorry, in the question-answer period. So thank you all very much.